Welcome to Starting Your Own Studio panel. This is the panel where you can figure out if you want to own a studio, start a business, start your business. You know, right off the bat, if everybody's here, record sales were equated, it would be over 500 million. But Mark, you've actually owned many studios. You've actually been in. How many actually locations have you actually had?
I had probably 7 locations in San Francisco and Bay Area, and then I've had 2 down here. I've been in 1 location here in Los Angeles at my house in Los Angeles for about 9 years now. We have a studio that's about a block from my house in Griffith Park that we converted an old mansion into a studio. I'm a guy who's actually moved to different locations several times, and you know, some of the first studios I built, we would spend a lot of money investing in building and wiring and things like that. Over the years, I've changed where I have all my gear is basically set up in racks with multi-pin connectors. And when I move into a studio, the place I've been in for 9 years, we move in, I put in my console, my rack's up, I just lay my cables behind the console on the floor, and if I decide to move, I can unplug it and have it set up somewhere else in about 2 days. I've kind of stayed with the mobile setup, and even though I've been in one place for 9 years and really happy there, it's, if I decide to move, I'm not throwing $300,000 out the window. I've run a lot of commercial facilities over the years, but the way the studio business has changed, that's a more difficult proposition running a big room as a commercial studio at this point.
Well, Dave Way can attest to that.
Yeah.
Dave owned a very large studio in L.A. called the Pass, and it had some very heavy-duty clientele. You want to talk about that?
Yeah. Well, when I started in New York 20 whatever years ago, I worked at a studio as an assistant at a place in New York called Soundworks, and the rate there was I think $3,000 a day for a 12-hour lockout, and they had outboard gear that got rented back. They had tape that got charged at a nice markup.
They charged for coffee too.
Just everything, and
that's
nobody batted an eye, and that was that was the way records were made, and everybody was happy. I mean, now the idea of a studio charging $3,000 a day.
It's like a weekly rate.
Exactly, monthly rate in some places.
Maybe for the whole gig sometimes.
Right, yeah. So obviously things have changed a lot since then, but the commercial rooms, I mean, it's basically just a lockout rate, and there's no other streams of revenue on top of that.
And Ken Jordan, who's one half of Crystal Method, he's another one, a very well-known composer, electronic musician. Can you explain your setup?
Yeah, our first album deal was, it was with a major label, or through a major label, but they did allow us to, make the record the way we wanted to make it. So they allowed us to use our studio, and our studio we had it for like 13 years. It was called the Bomb Shelter, and it was in this house that we rented to live at and to have our studio at. And we were renting the house, so we had to hide the fact that we had the studio from the landlord.
Okay.
And she was also crazy and kept driving by the house all the time. She was really paranoid. Eventually, she found out. I think.
But there's also, you have issues with soundproofing, neighbors, and especially if it's a home type studio.
Well, we had the 210 freeway basically in our backyard.
Okay.
So all that noise masked the sound of the studio. It was perfect.
Making records on big consoles like these guys will say, there is something nice about it, but there's a huge problem. It's called recalls. And everybody in this room in this panel will attest to it. If you make that perfect mix and the artist comes back to you and says, "Oh, it's perfect, but you gotta trim a little of this bass or trim a little vocals off, and then you gotta go all the way back. It takes you hours and hours. If you have an analog console to reset that. Whereas if it's all digital, you just push a few buttons and correct it.
Oh yeah. I mean, I have rooms with both digital and analog rooms, but I find myself working more and more on like the Icon kind of formats because Pro Tools thing, because a recall takes like 0 seconds, and then
of course.
And I actually don't care. I actually like my mixes on the analog console. I think it's not that they're better. It's just more artistic. You move, you make it happen. It's the moment. But then when someone complains about a recall, and now that the market is all about recall, you can't really have that luxury unless you're putting out the record yourself.
Yeah.
It's impossible to tell someone who's used to every other person they're dealing with going like, okay, no problem, bass 1 dB up and vocal 1 dB down. You can't. So I would say, yeah, at this point, digital is the only viable way to mix to just crank stuff out and make money. If you're doing your own records for yourself and for tone, that's a whole nother story.
You know, that's another issue about, starting your own studio. Do you want to have a gigantic analog console, which you could probably buy these days? These things that cost $300-400 grand in the old days, you can get them for 40 or 50 grand now. So do you want this big monster that does sound good, but that is not
It's
not
not
really.
convenient to workflow.
What's that?
Not convenient to
Yeah, it's
workflow.
not, the workflow is really a crucial part.
You know what I've noticed is I've seen there's a bunch of guys. Okay, we've all been doing this for,
a long
little
time.
while. Yeah, a little while.
Everybody
And
here.
But I noticed there's young guys who have only grown up in the Pro Tools world and have
course.
never really. They've only had the lust for the analog, old big format
course.
console days, and now that they see that
You can get-
it's achievable, they want to go for it. But I think you'll find most of the guys like us who have been around for a long time are like happy to say, great, I've been doing it like that for 25 years, 30 years. I know how that works, but you know what? I like this new way of working. For me, there's a lot of benefits to working
completely.
half and half.
Yeah, I mean, I
you know?
started in 1970. I started making records. I mean, I've done 40 years, and probably 25, 30 that was analog. And I love analog, but I mean, I figure I can make great records on anything.
I think
mean,
it's
to me,
skills
it's
are
just-
more important.
It's about getting a great
the
song,
vibe.
working great with the artist, getting the vibe. You can make great records.
Monitoring, though, I
on
have to
anything,
say, a good monitoring environment is the one thing. If you're going to spend money on a studio, no matter what kind of console or anything you have, make sure
yes.
your monitoring is
Right.
true
Right.
and something that you really get and can trust.
Well, that's the first thing when I set up my room. Then I made
yeah,
sure I
look
got
at
the
monitors, Howie.
most expensive
Well, yeah, I
monitor.
mean, come on, yeah.